War in Field of Glory Empires. How does it work? How do the battles work? How do the units work? We're going to talk about that right now. I'm going to teach you everything you need to know. It's actually pretty simple. So right on the center of the screen here, we have an army, which you may hear me refer to as a stack. That is just slang. Every stack is made up of units. This stack is made up of 11 different units. What are those units? They're these units. They're split up by type right now, but they can become more condensed as you start to fill all of this up. Every row can have 8 units displayed at once, and there are 8 rows total. Again, they can go further up than 8, but they will not go further out than 8. You have infantry that make up the front line. You have skirmishers of different kinds that, depending on their range, they can start out in front of your infantry to get their skirmishing in and then retreat, or they can go in the back if they have like bows and better range and skirmish from there. You have cavalry, which is not just limited to melee, but is also something that can be a skirmisher type unit as well. They like to stay on the flanks. However, there are some cavalry, like heavy cavalry, that work more like infantry, where they can go on the flanks, and in fact, they will default there, but lacking enough infantry for the front line, you will have units fill in for them, and heavy cavalry are actually pretty darn good at that and much faster than foot infantry, as opposed to lighter cavalry, for example, here, that are going to do way better on the flank. Now, how do you know who's better at what? Well, very simply, if you hover over any unit, and then you hit control, you hold control, then you'll get a whole bunch of stats. And I can't really point to them, but going from the top down, combat power is kind of just an arbitrary rating of how good the unit is, in case you don't want to read everything else. Hits is the literal amount of hits that will be dealt using the available attack stats, for example. Whereas defense will be going up against someone else's attack and hits. Effectiveness is kind of a rating of how much of their total potential they can reach. You can have less total potential right here, 1 out of 2. That is a bad thing. You see the combat power rating goes down because of that. That happens when you're running low on supply, or when you've already maybe taken some damage, you've been hurt. Depending on the unit, you may have range stats as well, attack, defense. The range will determine whether or not for skirmishing a unit has to be essentially on the front line or not. Archers will have much better range than skirmishers and other melee units that have the ability to, for example, throw pylum. Siege value and resist. The siege value is how good that unit is at besieging something. Rome has a lot of specialized units that don't really fit the mold of most units. Usually regular infantry are good at besieging and then heavies are not. But in terms of Rome here, their heavy infantry can actually be good at many things. As we're seeing here, they have a pretty good siege value, actually, better than most regular infantry. Siege resist is a resist to siege. So for example, if I am outside of a town that has walls like this, see, it says unbreached walls, and you can also see the walls themselves, then my siege value total of my army will be put up against the total siege resist of whatever garrisons and armies are inside the city. And you can go inside a city. For example, I could travel out here, or I could travel, in here and garrison it. I can also, speaking of movement, you just right click, you can also hit garrison to determine whether or not you're entering if you want to be really sure. But we'll talk more about that stuff in a bit. Looking at other stats, there is the flanking modifier. This is what I was talking about with the cavalry. I said that they could also fill the non-flanking roles. Flanking roles are specific. There are like cavalry only roles, for example, where only cavalry can fill. However, you do not need to be in a cavalry spot to actually flank. Infantry, if they outnumber enemy infantry on the front, can flank. A flank is literally just when 2 units go up against each other, and then there's nobody on the other side, only 1 unit stepped up, then he will attack the flank of the person besides him. So This is why it's really important to make sure your front line of infantry units is always filled. You always have some backups. This is what you'll need the most, and you fit a different amount of units onto different battlefields based on their terrain. There is technically a terrain setup here that you could see. I forget where that is, but you can also just hover over anywhere you see. It says this is a plain, it says it has a paved road, this is a hill. These affect how many units you can fit. Now, the battles aren't clear-cut, because if you own Field of Glory 2, you can import battles from this game into that game and fight them there, and a lot of the stats I'm telling you won't matter. However, I'm assuming most players of a game will not own a companion game that they then play along with. So let's just ignore that, and I'm not going to explain Field of Glory 2 to you. There are other things to keep in mind here. There's upkeep. The bigger and better of a unit, the more money, metal, and manpower it will cost. That's the resources we have up here at the top. And then food usage as well. It is produced locally. If we click on a location, we could see the amount of food that we are making and the amount that is stockpiled. If we have a province, for example, we form the entire province, you can see it being highlighted here, of Italia Superior, then the different locations will actually share their food in case one runs low. And there are buildings as well, usually in the health line or the food line, that will grant free supply that does not consume food but cannot be used in place of food. So you want to keep your eyes out for buildings like that. Then we have special things. So for example, I said Rome is special. It is. Legions have a Legion debuff, where they have an attack penalty, a defense penalty, and a movement penalty if you are in forested, swampy, and mountainous terrains. They don't all call themselves that. They are color-coded. So you want to look out for the example, dark green, this kind of like cerulean-ish looking color, and then gray terrain. See, plains here are a light green. They are fine. They are not one of those terrains. You would not have that debuff there. That's the whole point of the ally, for example. Still a heavy infantry, but the big thing is that even though they're not as good, especially on the offense, they are not going to suffer that debuff if you get into those terrains, but they're also not as good at besieging, but they're still better than most heavy infantries at that task for most nations in the game, honestly. Now, here's where you have to start watching your maybe video game lingo, or I need to start watching mine, right? With ranged units, we do have ranged attack and ranged defense. In the ranged phase, this is generally what is being used. You're putting your ranged attack up against an enemy's ranged defense, and the damage that is done is done. This sort of damage does not affect their health, only their armor. There's armor and health, and this is what it affects. Separate to that, we do have a skirmisher rating, which is a bit different. This determines fatigue that is inflicted. This mostly counts as a bit of a support role, I guess. You would want them. You would want this for supporting purposes, for achieving this, separate to, you know, having range. There is also the status of being a support unit. Support units get bonuses if you put them right behind a fellow unit in support. They will add to melee that is happening. They will add to the dice roll. Normal units can do this too, they just don't do it as well as a support unit. There's a lot of like overlapping terms here, but hopefully I've explained that an understandable amount. Since this is a WeGo system, then whenever you hit end turn up here, all armies will move at the same time. Fights happen when your and enemy armies end up in the same place at the same time and they decide to fight. And there can also be fights that go over multiple turns. The armies might even retreat off of these locations if they're getting their butts beat enough, or if they're too scared of the result. You, and for example, your allies ending up in the same place at once, this can go for 2 stacks of yours, or a stack of yours and a stack of your allies, can team up in fights just by being in the same place at the same time against a common enemy, if we ended up right here, for example. Now, what are you going to fight? If I moved here to attack, which we could have happen, for example, I'm not going to fight this 5-stack army. That's not what's going to happen. Because if you hover over a location, you'll see it will defend with 7 units. That's a garrison. If I fight that 7-unit, like, civil defense force, kinda, then these very weak units will come out to fight me. If there's a stack as well, then they will help. Hopefully for the defender, the stack is better than the civil defense units, which is usually skirmishers and an urban militia. However, it gets more complicated when we throw walls into it. When we throw walls into it, that defense force will usually stay within the walls. A actual stack will defend where they are. They will usually defend, unless they retreat, right? They'll usually defend either outside the walls, if that's where they are, or inside the walls, if that's where they are. So placement is very important. Just because a stack is outside the walls doesn't mean the civil defense force within the walls are going to march out and help them as well. It's another thing to keep in mind. And then when you are there, as I mentioned, your siege value against the siege resist of whatever's in there, which is usually stack, garrison, but it could also be some buildings contributing some things as well. Population and buildings can contribute to a garrison. You cannot just decide to make a garrison. You'll have to actually go and make military buildings, some of which grant garrisons. For example, like a coastal fortress will grant a garrison. Looking at the army separate to garrisoning, you can also order an assault. So for example, here, unbreached walls 2 of 2. If that gets down to 0 or 1 or whatever, and you want to take the place over right now, ideally 0, by the way, they're all breached, hopefully, then you can order an assault the next turn if the place still isn't surrendering. The more breaches in the walls, the better the assault is going to go, of course. You don't want any walls that are unbreached, ideally. That's what assault does. There's also pillaging. So if you are meeting the requirements here, be in a region where you have combat units, it's disloyal and not pillaged, then you can pillage it to get some resources, but this is a very scorched earth kind of thing. I'm not really sure if you would even want to do this. Retaliate. This is kind of a skirmishy sort of thing. Instead of going into an enemy region to capture it, then if I enable retaliate and then go into an enemy region, then I will go in there and then simply fight and return back. The whole purpose is to go in and beat up whoever's causing you problems and then get back to base as soon as possible. That's the whole purpose of this. You have to use it very specifically. You could disband everybody inside of it. You can even split it into multiple groups here and then merge them back together like so. You can rename them to whatever you want. Now we have the whatever you want Legion. There you go. Recruiting units is quite simple as well. If you have a province formed, then it will happen in a province. Otherwise, it happens in a region. You have equipment. This is another resource that is local to a location. Military buildings can add more to this. You can recruit anything that has a little green flag. That has a red flag, then that means one of a couple things. Number one, it could mean that, here's a good example, you can only recruit it in certain locations. That's a thing. You could simply not have the building to make it. It'll do its best to tell you, thankfully. Some of these things are just not part of the national recruitment pool, meaning you're pretty much never going to be able to recruit them because of the nation that you picked. Some units are not part of any national recruitment pool and they only exist in certain circumstances. Like an urban militia, for example. I don't think anybody can recruit urban militia. These are the things that pop up to defend cities. Same thing with a large siege engine. When recruiting units, there are some fun price differences here. I guess we could talk about this. There's a cost, immediate. That's the top number of money, manpower, and metal. The cheaper, weaker units usually don't cost metal. Metal's a rarer commodity and equipment, but equipment you don't have to worry as much about. If it stacks up, then you know it's not going to overstack. Can't really use it for anything else. And at the bottom, you have the upkeep you'll have to pay after. So money, manpower in this case. There are special units, such as this, like the Early Republic Legion. This is usually saved for provincial units, but like I said, Rome is different. Where every one of these you have makes the initial cost 25% more expensive. So recruiting a lot at once, whatever you can fit into one turn with your equipment, is a pretty good idea to stave off costs, but those costs will be higher next time you decide to recruit them. So having different provinces for it can be useful if it's a provincial unit. Again, legions are different, but You see some of these units have much higher upkeeps and much higher costs to them, but you can also preview their stats as well as their movement speed. Movement speed is another stat, by the way, determines how far they get. Of course, cavalry will have better movement stats, and you can see those special things here lined out with symbols as well. Bonuses or debuffs in certain terrains, skirmisher capabilities as well. You simply recruit a unit, add it to the pool, consumes equipment. Whenever you get to the point of not having enough equipment, you see right here, then it'll go into, well, we'll recruit it a different turn, not this turn. Right click to get rid of them, and there you go. That's how you recruit. As little add-ons and notes to everything I've covered so far, you can always click on a location and hover over this right here to see the cost of movement, as well as if the terrain provides any buffs to the defender. So that would be to the defender's defense stat, which only plays when you're being attacked. The attack stat will apply if you're initiating the attack. The frontage shows how many units will fit on the front line, and the defensiveness of a location at a brief glance can tell you how hard actually taking over a location would work. This is kind of like effectiveness. It's just a rating that you can look at. When talking about ship stuff, it's a little bit different. Most of the same stuff applies except for this. As we can see, the frontages are generally going to be pretty high when we're out at sea. Then also coastal fortresses, if built, can hurt units, ships that are bordering. So if I have a coastal fortress here and an enemy fleet wanders here, it will hurt them every single turn. If there are ports like this, you can also blockade a location from receiving the benefits of its ports as well if you'd like. Land units can immediately go out to sea for a cost and be on little transport boats. You do not want these being engaged. Simply put them in the same fleet or together with an actual fleet, and then you will be able to escort them. Naval units are quite simpler. They're simply like light, medium, and heavy ships, generally speaking. Generally, with any fight, you want to fill up the front as much as possible, but the best stuff you can afford to fill it up is, of course, going to be the best. It works more like kind of just having infantry. Supply is generally provided by nearby friendly locations, and certain things like harbors and coastal fortresses can actually spot out into, you see the fog of war there is actually revealed, into neighboring sea units for you without you needing to have anything there. So if an enemy fleet rolled up here, I would see it. If one rolls up here, I would not see it. Kind of scary, right? Especially if I'm planning to set sail and then go invade Carthage and Sardinia, for example. Finally, every army and navy can have a general assigned. Generals are decided by some base things, such as your military rating of your leader. Every time you get a new leader, then it's going to change. The way leaders work can vary greatly. With Rome, it's rating it by party, and there is party strength to rate it. However, by many other nations, most other nations, there are simply rulers that will age and die. Generals also have ages, and they will die, and you will get new ones. There are buildings under the military line, where if you build enough tier 2 military buildings, you'll be able to build military schools. Some wonders also affect this as well, that will grant you more military leader slots regardless of anything else that is happening. They can have their own special things like Relentless here that affects the whole stack. You see, this will give movement bonus to the whole stack and a defense penalty, but he's also giving a defense bonus and offense bonus. Even a general that has 0 and 0 and no special things will still benefit an army if you have the general there. Also, when the units have some time, they will train, developing little stars here, which will increase their combat rating. If you assign a general, this will initially go down because they're getting used to a new leader. It will take time to train it back up. But a trained up stack with a leader is always going to be more valuable than a trained up stack without one. Same thing with a untrained one. Untrained with one versus untrained without one. A general with terrible stats is generally going to do better so long as they don't have like this terrible thing that gives massive debuffs and they don't have the ratings to make up for it. Generals can die in combat even if you win with flying colors, so that's something to keep in mind. Always keep an eye on your generals and make sure you have the best ones assigned with enough time to train your stacks back up, which again is a passive process. Then at a glance, if you want to see how strong other factions are, you might go up against, just go into the ledger, go to factions, select by land power or naval, and then you can see sorted where you stack up to the others in the world, as well as much other information that you might use to consider what you will do. You can also go ahead and see your own armies here in case you're having trouble keeping track of them. You can get a little bit of a summary. Or if you have any allies, then you can start clicking on them as well to see what they have available in their line of sight, what you know a nation has anyway. But that's pretty much all the basics of how war works. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments below. If you want to see any other guides, feel free to suggest those in the comments below. I'll be putting everything in a playlist that's in the description below. For now though, I hope this guide has helped you. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one.